Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into a psychiatrist's guide to anxiety medications, starting with the very first options a doctor considers and going all the way to the last resorts. All right, let's get right into it.
So, let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. The core philosophy here is that the most important part of treating anxiety isn't actually a pill. It's the psychological work. Think of meds as a helpful tool, maybe a band-aid, but they are absolutely not the main event.
And you might be wondering, why is that? Well, it's kind of paradoxical. Anxiety, as awful as it feels, creates this activation energy. It's that discomfort that actually pushes you to do the really hard work in therapy. So if a medication completely flattens that feeling, it can sometimes, ironically, take away the very motivation you need to get better for good.
With all that in mind, how do doctors actually decide what to prescribe? Well, they use this sort of mental flowchart, or what we call a treatment algorithm. It's not a rigid set of rules, but it's a super logical, step-by-step approach that always starts with the safest and most effective options first.
Here's the basic roadmap. Step 1, you almost always start with a class of drugs called SSRIs. If that doesn't quite do the trick, you move to Step 2. Either try a different SSRI or add something to it. That's called augmenting. After that, you've got a whole expanded toolkit for more specific situations. And finally, way down the line, you consider the last resort option.
So let's jump into Step 1. The journey pretty much always kicks off with SSRIs, which stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitors. They're the first choice because they work well for anxiety, and, this is really key, they have fewer messy interactions with other medications compared to some of the older drugs. Two of the most common ones you'll hear about are Zoloft and Lexapro.
Okay, so if they're both good, how do you choose? Well, while they're both solid, Zoloft often gets the first look for a couple of really practical reasons. Your body breaks it down through multiple different pathways, which means its effect is generally more consistent from person to person. Lexapro, on the other hand, relies heavily on one pathway that can vary a lot between people, making it a little less predictable. Plus, with Zoloft, it's just easier to make those tiny little dose adjustments.
Right, so what happens if that first SSRI isn't working, or maybe it's only helping a little bit? This is where a doctor moves to Step 2 of the algorithm. The next move is either switching to a different SSRI or augmenting the one you're already on.
Augmenting just means adding a second medication to give the first one a boost. Two really common options here are buspirone, which is a non-addictive anti-anxiety med that tends to work best at higher doses, and gabapentin, which was originally for seizures but has been found to be really helpful for anxiety too. Now this brings up a huge and often pretty heated debate. What about those as-needed meds for when you're in the middle of a panic attack? You know, the ones you only take in the moment. It seems like a perfectly logical idea, doesn't it?
Well, the expert view on this is pretty clear and pretty strong. The big problem with as-needed medications is that they can completely short-circuit the most important lesson you need to learn to overcome anxiety, the deep-down belief that you can handle it. Every time you reach for that pill, you're accidentally telling your brain, I can't do this on my own.
All right, let's move up to the next level of the algorithm. Once you get past the standard SSRIs and their helpers, clinicians have a much wider, more specialized toolkit for very specific situations.
And this is where treatment gets really personalized. Say you have anxiety and a chronic pain condition, like fibromyalgia. An SNRI might be a great two birds, one stone option. Or what if your anxiety is just about one thing, like the terror of public speaking? A beta blocker like propranolol can be an absolute game changer. It doesn't touch the mental worry, but it stops the physical stuff, the racing heart, the shaky hands.
Let's circle back to gabapentin for just a second, because it has this really weird property. It's called nonlinear pharmacokinetics. It's a fancy term, but the idea is actually super simple. Your body can only absorb so much of it at one time. It creates a sort of traffic jam or a bottleneck.
And you can see this in action perfectly on this chart. Look at this. At a 900 milligram dose, your body absorbs about 60% of it. Not bad. But if you try to take a massive 2400 milligram dose all at once, your absorption rate actually tanks to just 35%. It's proof that a bigger pill isn't always better, and it's why splitting the daily dose into smaller chunks is so critical.
But what about those cases where someone has tried multiple things and is just not getting better? For these really tough, treatment-resistant situations, we have to move to the very last steps of the algorithm. These are the last resorts, powerful older drugs that come with some pretty big trade-offs. So we're talking about medications like tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, and MAOIs. These are kind of the old school players. They were developed a long time ago, and look, they can be super effective. But they also come with a much heavier load of side effects, and some even require you to change your diet. That's why they're saved for when the newer, cleaner options just haven't worked.
And that brings us to the big one, the one you've probably all heard about, and definitely the most controversial class of anxiety medications, benzodiazepines. Think Xanax, Valium, Klonopin.
These are considered a last resort by so many clinicians for very, very good reasons. Before even thinking about one, a patient has to understand the risks, and the list is long. We're talking about addiction, severe withdrawal, problems with memory and decision-making, and on top of all that, they can actually get in the way of making progress in therapy.
But real life is messy. It's not always a clean flowchart. There's this famous story about a patient who was totally debilitated by the obsessive fear that their hairdryer would burn the house down. Now, one team of doctors wanted to do all this intensive therapy, but another doctor offered a ridiculously simple solution. Just unplug the hairdryer and take it with you to work. The point is, sometimes the goal isn't some perfect theoretical cure. It's just practical, real-world function.
And that story brings up such a crucial point. This whole journey doesn't begin and end at the pharmacy. There are so many powerful, scientifically backed ways to find relief that don't involve a prescription at all. Let's take a look.
For example, studies have shown that a specific preparation of lavender oil, taken in capsule form, actually has a measurable effect on anxiety. And of course, you've got the heavy hitters, things like mindfulness, therapies like CBT, and just basic lifestyle changes. I mean, think about it. That morning coffee, that triple shot espresso could literally be fueling your anxiety cycle without you even realizing it.
And this all brings us to one final, really provocative question. What's the actual goal here? Is it to wipe anxiety off the face of the earth? No. Anxiety is a normal, even necessary human emotion. The real goal of any of these treatments is to improve your function, to suffer less, and to live a bigger, more meaningful life, even if anxiety is still along for the ride.